Good morning, men. Whoa, you guys are awake. Awesome. It is. Yeah, it's just been a great year. It's been a great 13 years, I believe, to see men come out, and encourage men has probably made more difference in my life than probably any other thing, and so it's been really good. I do want to thank you. I am the guy that holds the money bag. I do want to thank you for all the donations, and we are in good shape financially, so I appreciate that. And just one reminder: if you did not sign up for couples night, the sign-up sheets are back there, and so do that if you could do that today or next week. And we are winding down. There's only a few more sessions, and we are so thankful for everyone that participated this year. At this time, Jason's going to be sharing this morning, so I'll ask Jason to come forward. It's been a pleasure serving with Jason over the years, and it's good to be here again. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you for your presence. Lord, we thank you for all these men that have come out. We thank you for the way that you work in our lives. And Lord, we just pray that you would guide and direct us this morning. I just pray your spirit and filling upon Jason, Lord, that he would share from your word and share from his heart. And I just pray that you would guide and direct his thoughts, his speech. I just pray that you would move through us, and Lord, that you would speak to us, and that we would then not only just be hearers of the word, but doers of the word. And we just thank you for your presence, and we ask this in the name of Jesus. Amen.
Thank you, Jay. Yes. How many of you saw the eclipse this morning? Awesome. How many of you should have seen the eclipse? No, just well, it's full moon, and I don't know if you saw it just before you came in here. There's not much of it left. It was pretty well going out the other side, but what an awesome Father we have to design a world that's absolutely beautiful and fabulous. We're going to talk about conflict this morning. None of you know anything about conflict, right? That's foreign language. So I would like to hear from you for just a little bit. When you think of conflict, what's the first word that comes to mind? What? Argument. Okay. Uncomfortable. Friction. Fun. What planet did he come from? What's that? Magnetic toys. Relationships, yeah. We'd like to talk about healthy conflict. You ever think that conflict could be healthy? You know, conflict, for the most part, in fact, conflict is neutral. Okay, conflict is neither positive nor negative, and so healthy management of conflict is growth. So our goal this morning is to talk about what could conflict look like when it's healthy, and how can we engage in healthy conflict, or can we? And that's really important. This whole year's been on leadership, and wow, I can't think of a topic more applicable to leaders than conflict. Because if you can't, you'll never be in a leadership position without running into conflict. It's just, that's inevitable. In fact, conflict is an inevitable part of life. So Romans 12:18 says this: if possible, for as much as lies within you, dwell peaceably with all men. That's a loaded, short verse. If possible. Now, that tells us something, doesn't it? It tells us that maybe it's not possible. In other words, there will be certain circumstances where it might not be possible to resolve all the conflict between you and another person, or between an organization and another person, or whatever. There are places where, and it depends, healthy conflict depends on Well, it doesn't depend on two people. It depends on one person handling it well. Whether it will turn out well determines how two people will handle it. And then it goes on to say, so far as it depends on you, as much as lieth within you. Does that tell you anything? That tells me that it's my responsibility to do everything that I can, as much as lieth within me, to dwell peaceably with everyone. And you think of all the relationships, and probably there's, we have some single people here, but there's a lot of marriages here, a lot of married men here. Can you be married without having conflict? Don't think so. Do not think so. You can't have a relationship. You can't have a relationship without having conflict. So conflict is an inevitable part of life. How we handle it will determine whether it becomes productive or destructive. And that is really important. Tools. Everybody needs tools. I'm a mechanic by trade. And I worked on things and I fix things. I use wrenches and drills and you name it, okay? There's lots of mechanics here, and there's lots of people who, even if you're not a mechanic, you're still a mechanic when you get home. We use tools. But guess what? Guess what mechanics do? They fix things. And I was a fixer. I would go home, I'd go to work, and people would praise me and pat me on the back for fixing their equipment. I'd go home, and Grace would not pat me on the back for trying to fix her. Thank you. She didn't want to be fixed. She wanted to have a relationship, and she wanted me to care, and sometimes it felt like she wanted me to do all the giving, and not for her to give. But you see, that was my perception of what our relationship was like. So under tools it says, be a gardener, not a mechanic. Because gardeners create an environment, farmers create an environment for growth. You get the ground ready. And then the ground is planted and you put seeds in that ground and then it can grow. And then it takes weeding, it takes cultivating, it takes watching over, or maybe Roundup. Only be careful with that in relationships, okay? Because sometimes it kills more than just weeds. And so we want to be a gardener, because gardeners create an environment. We don't make the seed grow. We don't make a relationship grow, but we create an environment for that seed to grow. I like what Tim and Kathy Keller do a teaching. They wrote a book called The Marriage Book. And in there they say to make a marriage work, it takes two people willing to care about what the other person cares about. And they say it is so important that we do not do things that are destructive to the relationship. She gives an illustration. She writes part of it, and he writes part of it, and they take turns, but she gave an illustration. I think I might have given this before here, so excuse the doubling up on it, but Tim Keller is a pastor from Pennsylvania, and he moved to New York City, and he started a church in New York City. It's called Redeemer Presbyterian Church, and it's become very successful. It's become very large. It's a huge church. He's now retired. But when they first moved up there, he was spending all his time building the church. They had 2 sons, and she saw that he was neglecting the family. And she approached him about it, and she said, when we moved up here, you said, give you 5 years to work at building this church. And he kept on working at it, and after the 5 years up, he did not make the adjustments to refocus on home, and she kept on talking to him, and what do we call that? But finally, he came home from work one day. He came home from the church one day and found her with a hammer on the patio in the back, smashing her good china. And he goes, "What are you doing?" And she says, "Well, nothing that I do gets your attention. You told me it was going to be 5 years, and now it's much past that, and you're still not focusing. And we have boys to raise. We have children to raise." And And so it caught his attention, and he did. He refocused. He saw how serious she was about it. What she had not told him is that she was just smashing the saucers of the cups she had already broken, that had already gotten broken. She said it was a managed temper tantrum, okay? So what she did, she got his attention, but in there they write, it's not okay to do things that are destructive to a relationship. So as much as lieth within us, we need to make sure that our part, we're doing the right thing. So if you look at your handout there, conflict is neutral. Our response makes it either productive or destructive. And then you have these two lines that are curved, and it's an entrance and an exit, and it says we enter untested. So when you enter a relationship or you enter into conflict, you're entering untested. How we come out the other side determines how we respond to it and what our response is. Because even if another person doesn't engage the conflict well, we still can. And even if the end isn't necessarily what we really desired, we can still come out healthy. But we need to look at what does that take. And so we can emerge from that conflict productive. It makes us stronger if we handle it well. It teaches us a lot about life. You know, conflict teaches us a lot about life. It really does. We can be authentic if we've handled it well. If we haven't handled it well, maybe we won't be authentic. Maybe we will just be one who puts on masks and pretends. It'll deepen us. It'll make us a deeper, richer person if we handle conflict well. And it's part of the maturing process of growing. It's why we want to teach our children. And it's so important, men, fathers, so important to teach our children to handle conflict well. Not just swing the switch, but to talk about how do they. And they need to see us handling conflict well. How well do they see us in our relationship with our wives and handling the inevitable conflict? It's going to be in our home, or it's going to be anywhere. Our children need to see us handling conflict well. That's really important. So let's look at unhealthy ways. And so when you think of and we talked about, I only heard one positive statement on what you think of when you think of conflict. Once again, I'm not sure what land he lives in. Anyway. He lives in the area of reality. We're looking forward to having breakfast together sometime soon. But unhealthy is to avoid. How many of you have a tendency to avoid conflict? That's me. I hate conflict. And when I see it coming, I try and skirt it. I try and get away from it. I hate conflict. Conflict is not fun. I don't like it with my wife. I don't like it with anybody. I just don't like conflict. And I've been in a lot of it. I tell people I went through 2.5 church divisions. Boy, talk about very, very painful experiences because the conflict was so intense. It's horrible. And there are lots of casualties in those kind of conflicts. So we have a tendency to avoid. But then the next one here is really big. We become defensive. You recognize that? When somebody approaches us with something, right away we bring it on. No, we're out to defend ourselves. We become defensive. And that's a normal response, because if we don't like conflict, and here it comes anyway, it just irritates us, and we get irritable. And we become defensive, and we start rationalizing all the reasons why the conflict isn't our fault. It's theirs. One of those church divisions, I was in leadership. And I could have told you why 99% of the problem was their problem. But I had a man come into my life, not from our church, but he came into my life and he helped me to see that I was hugely responsible for my part of the problem. Okay? And owning our part of the problem, and that is so important, to own our part of the problem. But also, he also taught me what forgiveness was all about. He says forgiveness is accepting 100% of my part of the problem without bringing up their part of the problem. That was where I was struggling. That was where I was struggling. But he taught me how to go about doing that. And so when I went back, and I didn't want to go back, but I went back to that fairly large church group and got up and asked their forgiveness. And I didn't bring up one thing that I saw was their part of the problem. I asked for forgiveness for what I had failed as a leader. I had failed in communicating in a healthy way. I had failed to care about the people that I was in conflict with. And you know what? It made a difference. It didn't restore the relationship, but it restored many relationships in the years to come because I was willing to humble myself and accept 100% of what was my part of the problem. And me talking about that, if I would have brought up their part of the problem, they would have saw me justifying my situation. Now, we're going to talk about a little bit later here because we do have to talk things out. That doesn't mean you don't talk things out, but in the middle of resolving the conflict, we need to see, and as much as lieth within me, I need to deal with who I am and how I have contributed to the conflict. So unhealthy is to avoid, to become defensive, or to withdraw. Oh, we're good at that, men. I am. I'm real good at withdrawing. In fact, that's what my tendency, even in our marriage, is when there's conflict, I have the tendency to go out to the shop or somewhere else, somewhere where I can avoid the conflict, because I don't like conflict. But that's not healthy either, because when we withdraw, now we've removed ourselves from the ability to communicate and even to work through the conflict. Now listen, brothers, I hope there's some practical application in this whole picture, because if there's not, there's no sense teaching it. There's no sense even looking at it. But this has been helpful for me. This made some changes in my life because I listened to somebody else teach this. And I started scribbling notes and turned it into my own teaching because it made a difference in my life. And I had just, when I sat through this teaching by another person teaching it, I had just come through a conflict that I had handled very poorly. And I had to go back and deal with it again. And I'm not going to give a lot of details there because that's still an ongoing relationship that's becoming healthier. And then the other thing is we resent it. We resent the conflict, and we resent the person who's representing the conflict. And when we resent people, now we create a problem. We create a problem because we're building a wall of resentment between us and that person. You've got to be careful with this. We got to be careful with this, because resentment will cause us to withdraw more, to become more defensive, and all that is going to be an unhealthy way of dealing with it. And so when all those things, those unhealthy ways, look at that little box underneath there, it postpones the inevitable, and likely the conflict's going to grow. So let's look at that, brothers. Let's take that into heart and say, okay, if I'm dealing with this, if I'm dealing with conflict in these ways, by withdrawing, by becoming resentful, by becoming defensive, and avoiding conflict, it only postpones the inevitable, right? I mean, it's not going to go away. It's not going to go away. Well, sometimes things seem to go away, but generally they don't. And when we handle conflict in an unhealthy way. So, to the center of that picture, we either talk things out or we act out. And so here's where discussion is really important. When there's conflict between my wife and I, we need to talk about it. We need to discuss it. We need to reason together. Come, let us reason together. That's what God says. That we're to reason together. And that doesn't mean us dominate. It means us to hear, but also to communicate. Communication is a two-way street. And you know, working on a teaching for the symposium on it's on sort of the damage that a patriarchal system can do to children. What's a patriarchal system? It's where, and I believe strongly that fathers are the heads of the home and us men are to lead, But when we lead with authoritarianism, it's our way or the highway, we create problems. And so when we are going to work through conflict, when you're talking with your wife, it's so easy for us to talk from a dominant position. And when we do, here's what happens. If here's two people talking, when we talk from a dominant position, we move ourselves up here and then we start talking down. How many of you love to be talked down to? Not one of us. You never, and Jesus, I loved how Jesus approached people. You know, Jesus says, I didn't come to be served, I came to serve. And so how I see how Jesus handled things and how I want to handle things is he became a servant. And so he would come and he would lift up. And that's what I want to do. I want to become the servant that helps other people grow and become who God has determined that they should be. So underneath there, we either talk things out or act out. Here's a big one, that little box underneath there, grudging compliance. Grudging compliance. You ever do grudging compliance? Me, I have. But when you come across with a patriarchal or a dominant position, oftentimes we can get our wives into grudging compliance. You ever do that? How many know that a grudging compliance wife is a happy wife? Absolutely not. Grudging compliance produces resentment, and resentment causes relationships to suffer. When you have somebody, resentment is the thing that gets inside of you. And when you resent something, you start chewing on it, and you start thinking about it. And then the more you think of it and the more you chew on it, the deeper the resentment grows until a root of bitterness starts. And when that root of bitterness starts, it keeps on growing, and it develops into a full-fledged plant, and it defiles many. Okay, grudging compliance produces resentment, and relationships suffer. So let's look at a healthy approach. Brothers, be approachable. Be approachable. When somebody approaches you, when somebody comes to you and there's conflict, or you approach somebody else, how you approach them helps them become more approachable. I told you when I heard this, I had just got involved with it. I was had walked through a conflict that did not go well. And it was because I didn't handle it well. Okay? I was neither approachable nor did I approach them in the right way. And we'll talk about this just a little bit different, a little bit later here, very shortly. But underneath there, we see difficult conversations. When you have to have a difficult conversation. But let's go back to the healthy, productive. Be approachable. When somebody comes to you and they say, "Hey, could we talk about something?" You want to immediately say, because right away the default is to go into the unhealthy. No, I don't have time right now. And maybe we don't, but then set up a time. Don't just say, I don't have time right now, without saying, well, how about tomorrow morning? Could we go out for breakfast? Or what about, could we meet after work tonight? Right now, I got my plate full. Things are happening, and things like that can happen. But set a time up. Don't just postpone it. Don't just push it off without setting the time up and asking, hey, what could we work? Let's get together. Oftentimes, that's a better way of doing it than even allowing it to happen right then. Why? Why? It gives you time to think. It gives you time to settle yourself. It gives you time to think about the situation. Now, if it can also give you time to build resentment. Okay. But if you're managing conflict in a healthy way, it gives you time to process. It gives you time to think, so that now, instead of reacting and coming back out of your emotions, you can process it, you can think about it, you can pray about it, you can ask for wisdom. You might even be able to, if you remember what the conflict is about, you can say, okay, maybe I need to get some input. You might get some positive input or some help in dealing with this. Be approachable. Be open. Be open to hear. And when you sit down to talk, or whenever you stand there to talk, or whatever, you want to be open. You want to be able to listen. And boy, we're not good listeners. Because usually when somebody starts talking, we are already processing what our answer is going to be. You ever do that? Yeah, we put so much energy into thinking about what my answer is going to be. But if we listen and we process, and I will usually, when I'm sitting down talking like that, I'll say, "Do you care if I take notes?" And I'll grab a pen and paper and I'll just start. I won't just sit there and write, because that doesn't work. What you want to do is you want to write conflict words. You want to write areas where that person is bringing up, or your wife is bringing up, and maybe you don't need to make notes, but you better make some mental notes. And hey, that's an area I need to come back and talk about. Okay, maybe there's a few things here, but if I make a few words, I can go back and say, now I can deal with those words. That's important. That's important, because it's so easy that as they're talking and they move from one thing that created a problem to the next thing, you lose this one. That's why I'll scribble notes. So important, because then you won't lose the continuity of it, and you won't lose what they're trying to communicate with you. Now, there's one there that I added in my notes, and you don't have it there, but be gentle. Okay, be gentle. Gentleness is important. Okay. If we're not gentle, if we're harsh and we come across, once again, it's that defensive approach. But gentleness is so important. And then acknowledge. Acknowledge is big. When somebody communicates to you, and then acknowledging is almost the same as the next one below, two below that reflective speech, is when you acknowledge, you are actually giving verbal or even nonverbal cues that you're listening, nodding your head, or saying, or even just an expression. Where the other day, Grace was talking. In fact, I think it was just yesterday. We were talking, and she moved from one box into another box, and I didn't switch boxes fast enough. You ever do that? Okay. and when she switched boxes, I was still in the first box, and then she says, "You're not listening." I said, "Yeah, I'm listening. What did I say?" That was bad. I caught some of it. Thankfully, I had a couple words that she had. But you see, I had lost where she was at, because I had not moved from one box into the next box, because I was still thinking about this. I should have tracked with her, and I did not. Although I do tell her, I said, "Listen, tell me when you're switching boxes." So. But acknowledge. When you're acknowledging, you're actually giving verbal clues that you're hearing. Or you might say, "Well, I have a question on that." It's okay to just slightly interrupt. Just say, "Hey, could you explain that more?" If you have a question that will help you understand the matter more, help them understand that you're hearing, or them know that you're hearing, you're listening, that you actually want to know, boy, you're creating an atmosphere where healthy conflict can move forward to resolution. Reflective speech, careful speech. Oh man, words come out so fast. Words are cheap. Words come quick, and words are damaging. "Sticks and stones will break my bones, but words will never hurt me," is a lie. Absolute lie. Words are horrible. You can never erase words. You can't take them back. You can do your best to ask forgiveness and heal, but words are very, very damaging. So careful speech, but then reflective speech. Reflective speech allows you and allows that person to know that we're still staying on track. Did I hear you to say that when I did this, it caused this to happen? Or did I hear you to say so-and-so or this, and it's that person? You see, it's reflective speech allows that person to acknowledge that you, first of all, acknowledge to them that you're hearing, but allow them to acknowledge that you're hearing properly and that you're hearing it right. Sometimes when somebody approaches you, they're intense and they're frustrated, and their speech might not be very clear, and they might not be communicating well. But when you do reflective speech and you say, "Hey, well, could I ask you more about that?" Well, now they know that you're hearing. And then you can ask a question that can illuminate it and bring more light into it so that you can communicate. So reflective speech, I actually taught this at Ebling's in our shop, because we had sales, we had service, and we had the repair end of it. And what I would see is I would watch miscommunication create conflict. And this was before Burnell's time, but the sales might communicate to the repair end of it or the mechanic end of it. Hey, would you prep this piece of equipment for me? Well, maybe they didn't give the right information, so maybe the wrong piece of equipment get prepped, or it would be prepped in the wrong way, or it wasn't ready on time. That created all kinds of conflict, and I was encouraging them all the time, do reflective speech. You're asking me to get this model ready, and you need to deliver it by 3:00 this afternoon. Okay, I'll do my best to have that ready. You see, reflective speech acknowledges that the communication was heard, and it was heard accurately. Because you see, in that reflective speech, maybe the salesperson would say, "Well, no, it's not that model. It's this model." And maybe even the salesperson got it wrong, but the reflective speech allowed them to correct it. It's so important. It's just simple ways of communicating that keeps communication from breaking down. Are you with me a little bit? Okay, it's just important stuff that we sort of take for granted and we don't practice it. So when you have healthy, productive communication like that, it allows you to negotiate, okay? And sometimes you have to negotiate a mutually acceptable compromise. Now, sometimes you can actually come to agreement and you realize, okay, we're on the same page. Man, this is great. We're agreeing 100%. But oftentimes in conflict, you will never come to that place because we are different critters. I don't think like you. And you don't think like me, do you? No. But you see, it's okay, but maybe if we communicate and talk it through, we can come to a mutually acceptable compromise. Okay, this is, in fact, I had a lunch yesterday, okay, where there's a tremendous amount of conflict going on in an organization. Tremendous amount. And whether they can come to a mutually agreeable compromise, I'm sort of questioning that. I'm sort of doubting that. I really am. But if you look at the next one then, or agreeing to disagree agreeably. Come on. Is that okay? Is it okay to agree to disagree agreeably? Absolutely it is. It's okay in a husband-wife relationship. It really is. Okay, my wife will see things differently than I will. And so much of the time in the past, I'm going to give you a couple, just an illustration or two. So much of the time in the past, I was so, we did not have a lot of money when we got married. In fact, I came out of a poor family, and I had this fear of being poor. And so Grace would tell you today that my favorite word was practical. If it wasn't practical, we weren't going to do it. It had to make dollars and cents sense to me because I wanted to be able to pay the bills, and so we lived very frugally. She would just say tight. Okay, so our communication would use different words there. And so I remember when we put a new kitchen in, and we needed a new kitchen. We bought an old house. It was built in the 1850s, and it needed a lot of work. But everything was, and so I was making a lot of those decisions. And later on, she goes, "Well, you got what you wanted." Well, our home is, your home is your wife's. She's the queen of that castle. And, if she doesn't enjoy some of those decisions, and even today, we have a nice kitchen, but it was what I chose, not what she chose. I wouldn't do that again. I would not do that again. I might make some strong suggestions, but I'm going to say, hey, you have to live with this. I made some poor decisions back then, and it created problems in our relationship, long-term problems. It's important for us to be able to hear the other person's perspective. And so just recently, in fact, yesterday I finished painting. Until this morning, she pointed out 2 areas I missed. You ever think, I painted the whole room and I was so pleased with it. Walls are all done, the woodwork's done, we're ready to start moving back in. And she goes, the 2 cubby holes down behind, in the desk areas of our counter. We have a wraparound counter. It's 2 desk areas there where she would do her sewing. I totally missed them. The room was an sort of pinkish, and we turned it into a beautiful green. And sure enough, I looked down there, and there's the old pink paint. Guess what I'll be doing today? I'll be doing cubby holes. Okay. But you know what I did? She picked out the paint, and we would talk about it. We discussed it. But I said, you know what? I want you to be pleased. When this room's done, I want you to be pleased. And you know what? She wasn't being very practical about it. She went and got 8 different samples of paint at Ace Hardware. You pay for those critters, you know? Enough said, okay. But working together, communicating, and understanding that it doesn't have to be my way, that there has to be some mutual agreement and negotiation, or agreeing to disagree agreeably. Those are all, that's okay. That is okay, to agree, to disagree agreeably. Now, sometimes it means that 2 people aren't going to walk together. Can 2 people walk together unless they're agreed? Well, as a husband and wife, we have to agree on the majors. We have to. And as a leader, yes, I need to make sure that that's happening. But on the other hand, there's a lot of minors that it's okay for me to just say, you know what, it don't matter to me. If it's this green or if it's this pink or if it's this blue, it doesn't matter to me. I might have preferences and I might voice those preferences, but it doesn't matter. I'm still going to be able to enjoy that room. I'm still going to be able to get along with her. Let's go to difficult conversations, okay? Difficult conversations, and they are inevitable as well. And can you imagine? And so here is the thought process there, and that is, here's where I blew it when I told you I was involved with that conflict. It didn't work well. I knew that I needed to approach somebody about some really difficult things. And so I just walked up and started presenting the difficult things. And guess what I got? I got defensiveness, and then I got withdrawal. He just looked at me and says, Jason, you're not safe to talk to. And I need to take a break from you. That felt good. That felt really good. And I'm going, wait a minute. And if I give you the background, you'd understand, because I was being asked to do something for their environment, and it was not going well, and it needed to be approached, and I was taking a pretty direct approach, and I tried to speak the truth in love, but he was not ready. I did not ask for permission, and I think that's so key, is when you have a difficult thing to talk about, ask for permission to set up a time to talk about it, because that might have not been the best place or the time for me to talk about that. I should have said, hey, there's some things that we really ought to talk about, and it's going to be a little bit tense, but we need to talk about this. So when would it work for you? I wish I would have approached it that way, because then he could have prepared himself to hear some tough stuff. I just threw up on him, and he wasn't ready to be thrown up on. And it caught him off guard, and it was not okay. And boy, it's been a little while for us to rebuild, because I had approached it like this. I was way too confrontational. I should have asked permission. So when you're going to have a difficult conversation, even if it's with your wife, say, hey, we need to talk about this. We need to work through some things here that might be a little difficult. Say, when would be a good time for us to do that? Now, she might be avoidant. She might say, I don't want to talk about this. But, well, we have to talk about it, so tell me when it would work best. You see, because she might have to negotiate children, meals. Okay. You ever try and talk to your wife while she's in the middle of making a meal? I mean, you can do that, but what if she's in the middle of something and you are interrupting her process and her? It's not. It's better to ask for when it would work, and then it can work. So the question is do you use a hammer or do you use a soft velvet glove to talk? Well, maybe there's another approach, because what if you need a hammer? How about if you'd wrap the hammer in velvet, okay, so it doesn't hit so hard? Okay, there's ways of doing this. Speaking the truth, but speaking it in love. So truth can be very, very painful. Truth can hurt. But if you say it in a loving way, if you think about the other person, you think about how this is going to come across, and you think about how this is going to impact them, I want to tell you that my approach to that man months ago, that the after effects are still there, and you know it's gonna go away. It's gonna be resolved. It will. It is already, but it's taking some work. And it's, you know what? It's this dance, because he's sort of shy, wondering when I'm going to say the next thing that's not going to come across okay, because he has a lot of pain in the background, and I bumped that pain, and I wasn't conscious of how it was going to approach him. I didn't regret what I said. I didn't say the wrong things. I said it in the wrong timing and in the wrong way. Can you hear me? That's really, really important. Conflict is inevitable, brothers. Every single one of us, maybe even today. It's just that how we handle this determines what kind of a leader we'll be. Hey, Mary to Joseph. Can you imagine a difficult conversation? How do you think Mary should approach Joseph? Hey, Joseph, I'm pregnant. I bet it didn't come across quite that way. I have an idea there was maybe some calm conversation. But without that angel's intervention, it wouldn't have went well, because he minded to put her away. And he was doing it carefully. He was doing it kindly in private so that he could sort of protect her. But God had a plan there. But that was a difficult conversation to have. Very difficult conversation to have. We just had a speaker at our church, and they have a lot of children, many children. They have some bio children, they have foster children, they have adopted children. And one of those conversations was from one of those adopted children was, Dad, I'm pregnant. He said that was not an easy conversation to have. Yeah, you see, it wasn't easy for Mary to tell Joseph that either. What about Abraham to Lot? Okay, I think it's best if we separate. If we separate. You see, that wasn't an easy conversation either, but it needed to happen, and it did happen, and they worked it out. What about Paul and Barnabas? I find Paul and Barnabas' interaction with John Mark very, very fascinating. I have looked at that in talking to leaders and looking at leaders and conflict resolution. So there's things going on there. And I don't know if you ever thought about that, about what was creating that problem. Well, there was history. First of all, John Mark he hadn't been counted on to be reliable. And so Paul had a reason to do that. Barnabas is the one who would give people the second and third chance. Paul wasn't. Paul says he failed once, you don't get the next chance. And you know, when I look at that whole picture, Paul was it was early on in his conversion, and he had been out persecuting the church. He had some maturing to do. And you might disagree with me here, but I think this was part of Paul's growing process. You see, it was dealing with this conflict, and he came out the other side, even though it didn't end well there. Well, it caused 2 missionary journeys instead of just 1, which was a positive. Okay. But on the other hand, it did not totally destroy that relationship, because later on Paul says when he was in prison, send John Mark to me. He's profitable for my ministry, for the ministry. You see, it did not destroy relationships. That conflict, they ended up somewhere, and it doesn't give us the details in the scriptures, but somewhere they came to agreement in that. And even Paul and Barnabas were okay in the end. But it says the contention was so sharp that they split and went different ways. Men, sometimes it's going to be that way. But I think we should take a lesson from Paul and Barnabas and John Mark and say, no, that does not totally destroy a relationship. It opens the door for more communication to resolve that conflict. And they did it. We don't have the details, but we know the end results was positive. Brothers, we need, as much as lies within me, I am to dwell peaceably with all men. So I think Paul was very goal-driven, whereas Barnabas was relationship. And goals trumped relationship there. I think it might have indicated some spiritual immaturity on maybe everyone's part. How about Jesus? He was walking ahead of the disciples, and he heard them arguing. And so when they get to where they were going, he says, "So what were you talking about?" You know what they were talking about. They didn't want to tell him. Who's going to be greatest? You know? And then it's so interesting. And he sat down and he gathered them around. Isn't that it? He created an environment for healthy communication. When we need to talk about things as a group or in a group setting, or even, to me, I actually texted a man about a week ago and said, "Hey, could we get together and talk, have lunch or breakfast and together?" And he said, "Well, he said my time is really busy." He says, "Could we do a phone conversation?" And it's not the kind of conversation that should happen over the phone. Can you recognize that? There's sometimes you don't have that choice, but face to face, you look at other people's expressions, you end up sensing where they're at, and some communication ought to be face to face, ought to be in person. Sometimes you can't always do it that way. In fact, sometimes it's even best to not do it that way. So, having discernment and wisdom. But he sat them down, he gathered them around. He didn't accuse or find fault, but he taught them with humility. He showed them by example and his calling that they are not to be trying to gain the top position. So Jesus dealt with different things in different ways. What about the Pharisees? He spoke the truth. I think we have to understand that there's times when you're going to be dealing with people who are arrogant, and they need some people won't listen to you until they really get bumped pretty hard. And Jesus knew that the Pharisees needed to hear some direct stuff. But here's the whole thing. He dealt with the Pharisees. He dealt with the thieves in the temple. He made a whip. He drove them out. I mean, he was intense. He didn't say, "Hey, guys, come on, move out." No. He went in there swinging. And you can't hardly see Jesus that way, can you? But he knew he had the discernment to deal with the person in where they are. Brothers, I want to tell you something. We don't have that discernment all the time. And it's so easy for us to mistake a brother for a thief or a Pharisee. And then we lay into them and we create all kinds of problems. I've been there. I've done that. Okay? When I was communicating with that man directly and I created a problem, I was frustrated with how he was handling a situation. So I approached it with some of my frustration. You see, I created a problem because of my attitude and my lack of discernment of where he was. He was in pain, and I was frustrated with him. So men, I think we wrap it up here. It's time for us to go to small group. But humility, down there in the bottom. Humility comes from the Latin humilis, which means lowly, from humus, or ground. Isn't it interesting? The medium where growth happens. It's the medium where growth happens. Be a gardener. Let's be gardeners, men, in our approach to being in conflict resolution. I hope there's some good conversation during small group. On the flip side of your handout, it says God's ways. How does God function in the affairs of men? This is just something you can read on your own, but it's something I put together because I see people struggling with how God functions in our world. And so you can read over it. It's my opinion, plus $5 will get you a good cup of coffee at Starbucks. Okay. So anyway, I shouldn't say it's just my opinion. It's something I put a lot of careful thought into. But if you read over it, because in the third paragraph it says every decision ripples through countless numbers of lives, and we're caught up in this flowing current. God has built the universe on the concept of free will and choice. What I do today is going to matter, not only to me, but others as well as generations to follow. It might matter in the next 5 minutes, 5 years, or 25 years. My job is to recognize that it does matter. And then all the way, the third from the bottom, we should think of and live life in such a manner that we're carefully evaluating what we do, fully knowing it will impact those around us for generations. I know one of my motivations when I was struggling trying to conquer sexual sin was the fact that God says, "I am a jealous God. I will visit the iniquities of the fathers upon the children to the third and the fourth generation." Brothers, I did not want my children, my grandchildren, and my great-grandchildren to pay for my stupidity and my choices. So I put together that paper. Hopefully it's some wisdom that can bless you. Father, thank you for time together. Lord, you know very well you came into a world full of conflict, and you experienced conflict while you were here. Father, in the power of your Holy Spirit leading us, would you help us to be wise in our way of handling the conflicts that come into our lives, that we can handle them in a constructive